welcome back to Beating a Dead Horse. As always, I'm your host, Sean McKinda.
And I'm your host, Jackson Keller.
And this week we are talking about basically the movie that gets everyone into movies if you were around our age. We are, of course, discussing Inception, a movie that is near and dear to Jackson's heart and hasn't kept that place in my heart, but when it came out was absolutely very much so near and dear.
I'm here. I'm ready. I'm ready to start slinging some shit. I'm ready to make a fuckboy's case because I've gotten into many fights about this movie over the years. And
only a third of them have degenerated into fist fighting.
Only a third. And I am now ready to make my formal case for why I think this movie is unabashedly fucking great. And it is a movie that I have seen like 10 times and enjoy more every single time, including this time. Watching it again just reaffirmed all the stuff that I liked about it and thought was great. So this is absolutely an all-timer for me. And we're gonna have a discussion about that.
So this is basically your communion, is what you're saying. You go to it to reaffirm your faith.
Yes, absolutely. I am here. I am like every other like film white boy in the world. I am going to, sacrifice myself on the altar of Christopher Nolan. For particularly what I think is probably his best film. I might it's been a while since I watched The Dark Knight, but this of the ones that I have seen, I think this is easily a contender for his magnum opus.
Well, I haven't watched this movie in quite some time. I saw it a bunch when it came out because I saw it, the first time I went to see it with a dear friend of mine. And we left the theater and sat in my car and debated the ending for probably an hour just sitting in the theater parking lot. 10 years later, I realized how much of a folly that was. But from then, I saw it a good 4 times through school because teachers loved putting this movie on in my high school. I don't know why. They're all like,
really?
Hey, this is a great movie. It's kind of like psychology. I guess I'll play it. Oh, okay, sure.
Did your math teachers play episodes of Numbers all the time too? Because that's what ours did.
What is Numbers?
It's some like police procedural about like a math genius Rain Man guy.
No. We watched Inception and Ice Age a lot. I remember Ice Age quite a bit. And then, of course, we did also watch Arrested Development in AP chemistry, which doesn't really have anything to do with chemistry. My teacher just really liked it. So yeah, I haven't watched Inception since high school. So I went in this time really excited to watch it again. Basically, everyone I know absolutely adores this movie. You do. The significant other does. So I'm like, all right, cool. Let's see how this has held up for me. I have such fond memories of it. And I still enjoyed it. I don't want to say that it is a bad movie by any means, but there are some flaws to it that kind of stuck out in a bad way for me. And they're the type of flaws that, in general, I try and ignore. They feel kind of up the alley of a more CinemaSins-esque type of soiree, but it's one of those things where like they just kind of kept adding up as it went, and it kind of detracted from the movie a little bit. I still think the movie's solidly enjoyable. I think it's really interesting. There's a lot of really cool concepts going on here, but like they would just the quick rundown is they would set up a rule and then they would break it like 10 minutes later, and it was quickly agitating me. And not like angry agitate, but just like that itch in the back of your skull that you can't quite get, that just kind of kept growing as I was watching it.
So let's just call it spoilers right there for this nearly decade-old movie. I still highly recommend you watch it, but chances are you already have because it was a big pop culture thing. And so, and about that is that I think I consider Inception kind of what Rick and Morty is now. And that Rick and Morty is something that is also divisive. Or I don't even know if it's so much divisive. It's something that most people agree is generally good, but it has a contingent of people who don't like it or think it's overrated because of the fan base.
And there's
because
a culture around it that is insufferable.
Well, I don't know how much of that is the culture and how much of that is projection, but that's a whole argument for another day. But I think it is just like it's a movie. It's a property. Whenever there's a property that positions itself or has an idea or has an atmosphere that seems sort of like heady or smart, that's immediately what people will argue about, whether it is as smart as it thinks it is. And that's what people argue about with Rick and Morty now. That's what people argued about with Inception back then. And in both cases, I think it doesn't fucking matter at all, because the movie is accomplishing everything it wants to do, in terms of theme, in terms of character, in terms of emotion, in terms of the stuff that matters, where the machinations and a lot of the atmosphere and the posturing, those are really just kind of the tangible elements. And I think that's something that in discussions of works like this, of works like Rick and Morty, that get sort of lost in sort of these bigger, like kind of like hot topic, hot button, like finger quotes, smart movies, because there's more to a movie, I think, than whether or not it's smart. I actually think whether or not a movie is smart in terms of like what sort of concepts it's dealing with, like if that's how you're defining smart, like how much it engages in like psychology or whatever, or like physics, again, a lot of Rick and Morty comparisons to be made here. I actually think that whether or not it is talking about those things is one of the least important things about a movie, as so long as it's staying true to its characters and its themes. And really, the reason that I wanted to pick this movie to talk about on the podcast, in addition to just being one of my favorites, is that I think that the way it handles death is very interesting, because it's handling it on a lot of different levels, because it's using it as like a motivator for the characters in terms of their backstories, using it as a motivator for the characters in terms of the present. It's using it as a source of tension. It's using it as a relief of tension, in terms of the visuals of like people being shot and shooting themselves. And so the way that the movie treats death tends to fluctuate, depending on the situation. And I think that where and what and how in those instances it comes up is a really big part of what makes sort of the central themes and the central questions still resonate. And I think that the question, the classic Inception question of the ending is like, is Cobb still in the dream, or did he make it back to his family? But that's not really what the movie is about. That's not really the important question. The important question is whether it matters that is really his family. And that's the thing that I think the movie is using death as a vehicle to explore.
This is going to be a rough one for us to kind of talk about, because I think that there's going to end up being a lot of semantic arguments around this movie, and like just little things that you were saying as you were discussing essentially the setup to our conversation are just little things that jut out to me that I kind of want to be like, well, here's how I interpreted it, and I think that kind of undermines some of the points that you were making. And like, I guarantee this is going to be a back and forth very much along those lines, where it's just going to be a lot of semantic discussion on it. So like, I'm just jumping off right off the bat from your discussion of, does any of this really matter? Because like the top, if somehow you're listening to this and you don't know that the top doesn't entirely fall, but it doesn't entirely not fall at the end of Inception, congratulations, somehow you have managed to avoid spoilers for a huge movie. But also, like, when you start understanding what the movie is about, you realize that that is not Cobb's top. That is the top of his dead wife, so it's the totem of his dead wife, so it's not his totem, because his totem is his children, and when he sees the face of his children is when his reality is, it's actually real life. And like, I feel like just that understanding does kind of undermine how the top scene plays, just because as a shorthand for the idea that reality is it not doesn't really matter, it works just fine. But it's such a resounding yes, this is real life when he sees the faces of his children, that I think it kind of does a little bit of damage to that idea.
Well, so for starters, you are correct in that it doesn't matter because the top is not his totem, it is Maul's. So in the logic of the movie, theoretically it shouldn't work for him. The reason he does it is because, it's part of the fiction that he keeps spinning in his head, and I think that it can pretty much be said without a doubt that the movie is about fictions and storytellings. But I'm gonna question the what we're sort of the assumption that the kids have to be his totem, because that doesn't really following the rules of the totem, like, that doesn't really make sense either, because the kids are people. So if they're the totem, then like, wouldn't they know about it? And that wouldn't exactly work either. And in fact, the way that totems work is left pretty vague. And that's another thing that I think the movie plays to its strengths with, is that it does leave a lot of stuff pretty vague generally, in order to help replicate that feel of the dream. And if we are talking about logical things, one of the cool things about dreams, of course, is that they are illogical by nature. And one of the criticisms of this movie I've seen a lot, actually, is that the action that we're seeing is too logical for a dream. But I mean, I just see that as a necessary compromise for making a action movie.
That's a weird criticism, to be perfectly honest.
Well, it's more about, like, this movie always gets brought up when people talk about Christopher Nolan as like, oh, like, he's so dry and humorless and like it's all this weird stuff, which honestly, like, a lot of those criticisms, especially as they pertain to this movie, I don't see at all, because in a lot of places it feels charming and funny and kind of warm. So I mean, I don't really get it, but that's sort of neither here nor there. Mostly what I wanted to talk about is I wanted to come back to knowing whether the top layer is real. But I think even if we are operating under the assumption that the kids have to be his totem and that's his true sort of signifier and not just sort of an element of his dreams, I think that that's still not necessarily encompassing the whole, like, broader argument about kind of cognition and the way that we think of things as stories, the way that we only put things together and declare that certain things are real kind of arbitrarily. Because this, what I was thinking about, kind of tying this into death in a more concrete way that we haven't really been doing until now, is that with the scene where Maul drops from the window and kills herself, that, obviously ends up being the central sort of, like, fridge motivator for Cobb. But thematically, what I think that's doing is still just playing into the idea of, like, the uncertainty of reality itself. Just because, like, if you think about it, even in the real world, nothing we can say, is objectively true or objectively happening. We can only see what we observe. And what movies like this are sort of getting at is that, within the logic of a dream where, like, people will go under for, like, hours and hours to, like, live a whole other life, and sort of what Cobb ends up saying to Maul in the end, is, or at least is the projection of Maul in Limbo, is that, they wanted to grow old together, but they did, like, in terms of their cognition, in terms of what they saw and heard and experienced, like, they did spend their entire lives together. So I think that even if we can objectively prove that we're in the top layer in terms of the dreams of the movie, we can't really objectively prove that we're on the top layer of, like, the reality as it is, even. Because if you think about it, that's where the whole argument behind, like, an afterlife comes from, that there is some sort of plane or layer beyond that is somehow better. And in Maul's case, we see her, taking the argument that, this layer is only a dream and we're going to wake up to the real reality, like when we kill ourselves. But that's really not so different from this idea that that there is, something better, some sort of heaven at the end. And I think that, so really, I think just the whole question, again, it just sort of misses the forest for the trees and doesn't really get at what the story is trying to say about, like, a person's, like, lived experiences. Like, I think, therefore I am. Like, everything is as real as, we experience it, because there's nothing that we can say concretely really is real. How do we... God, I almost tried to pull out that stupid fucking Jaden Smith tweet. I just need to, like, have that printed out so I can look at it, because I keep thinking of it.
Eyes are real if mirrors aren't.
If mirrors aren't, there we go. That's it. So yeah, not to go full Jaden Smith, but this is where I think, and I think even this model of the movie is still, like, a little bit reductive, but this is where I like the theory that the whole movie is just a metaphor for the process of filmmaking, specifically, because, and, I've heard this gone back and forth, so I don't remember exactly how it goes, but, like, basically, since Fisher ends up being kind of a vessel for the audience, the whole goal of the team is to create this convincing narrative that doesn't necessarily, and this is why I love this movie so much, because I think in the premise, it actively rejects a lot of, like, the CinemaSins sort of, like, nitpicking, but the idea of Inception is not that everything you do in the movie is in a movie, if we're accepting this as the metaphor, not everything you do in a movie is going to necessarily line up logically 100%. What's important is that it feels true emotionally, that there is the catharsis, and then you have each character kind of roughly corresponds to a different role in the film. Like, Cobb's the director who brings his own sort of baggage along unavoidably, and you have, I think Ariadne's supposed to be the writer because she sort of constructs the world, and Saito's the executive funding it, and Eames is the actor. And so you got all this stuff that correlates to the process of filmmaking, and I think that's neat. I think that's a nice, finding those, like, actor, and, maybe Christopher Nolan did intend, like, for it to be about filmmaking more specifically, but I think, I don't like framing it in just that way, because to me, like, this is just a movie about the power of a narrative more generally, and the power to change someone's cognition by making them feel something, I think, is just the ultimate ethos of movies and fiction and narrative more generally, and precisely gets to like, what it is that makes me so passionate about these things. And that's why I'm really, really fucking passionate about this movie.
I don't honestly have any sort of rebuttal to you. I guarantee, like, to let our listeners into a little bit of how this goes down is I do have to edit this podcast. I feel like I'm going to listen to your argument again tomorrow, and I'm going to actually be able to come up with, like, counter arguments and like ways I could debate you in this and whatnot. But like as you have been kind of discussing your ideas about the movie, I haven't really seen anything on it that has stuck out to me as like necessarily incorrect. I like what you're saying, and I don't think that is by any means a wrong interpretation, but I also don't really have anything to add or remove from it, so to speak. I think it's a very I don't want to say creative because that sounds dismissive of it, but it kind of is a very creative interpretation of the movie, and one that is I don't really know, honestly. It's hard to put it into words at this moment.
Let me try and ground it a little bit more in like the text of the film, because I think it relates to death. Because I know I felt the same thing the first time that I heard people talking about the movie in these terms. I'm like, oh, well, I mean, especially when you get into the business of like, Cobb being the director and each character having a certain role in like a film production team. I think that's where it's just like, oh, well, that's a nice interpretation, but like how much of that is really meant? And I'm gonna, apparently I'm just like an acolyte for Film Crit Hulk, because I'm just gonna parrot something that really stuck with me, way back when we were talking about Dunkirk, because he wrote an article about that film around the same time. But I remember one of the things that stuck out to me in his article very much, that just sort of like reaffirmed my view of this movie this way, is talking about how, that common criticism that Christopher Nolan films lack emotion. And I, again, to sidetrack, in this film in particular, don't know where that's coming from. Like, I got very emotional during a lot of parts, and not just the obvious ones necessarily, but it's talking about how the whole plot of the movie. So we get to the very end where Fisher is approaching the dream version of his dying father, and that Fisher he gets to have this one last conversation with him that he can't in real life because his father is dead. And after a very long, very tenuous sort of struggle and relationship, we hear his dad say once again that he was disappointed, and Fisher, then responds that like, I'm sorry that I know you're disappointed that I didn't turn out to be more like you. And of course the father then in the dream responds that he was disappointed that he tried. And it's this big like emotional moment. Like they set up the pinwheel, and like he finally unlocks the thing in the vault, and it's the pinwheel, and he has a good cry about it, and it's all very nicely staged and well directed, and is good, at least in my opinion, good at eliciting that intended emotion. But the thing about this scene is that it's a lie. It's a fabrication. His father wouldn't have actually said that. By all accounts, from what we see, like he truly was like kind of a deadbeat, and the characters even acknowledge it, even after Yeames goes in for the interview and they're sort of chained up in the top layer. Like he comes back and is like, oh god, like this is even worse than we thought, like this job's gonna be so difficult, like how can we get anything positive out of this? And the film sets up a lie that for Fisher and maybe even the audience, like I know that I like upon my first viewing way back when, like I was totally right there, like hook, line, and sinker with Fisher. And it's only when you come back to the real world that it's not just a it's not just a lie, but it's a lie done for a very particular and very cynical purpose. It's a lie in order to meant to make a giant energy corporation more powerful and remove competition. It's in order to become a monopoly, basically. It's done for completely corporate concerns. So it's really quite a sinister thing that's happening, that's presented in such nakedly emotional terms. But if you think about it in terms of like the metaphor for movie making, that makes a lot of sense, because what you do have with movies is these setups, these stories, these narratives, especially big blockbusters like Inception, is that we have these stories, these, very personal seeming works by these directors and writers and all these talented creative people, but ultimately it's all about the bottom line. It's all about making executives who don't give a shit about art or anything like that a bunch of money. And I don't think that the movie is completely cynical about this process of storytelling, of because that's again really what we're talking about. If we want to like take a step back from kind of the whoa tiger of the specific movie making metaphor, but I don't think it's super cynical about this process of storytelling, just because that is, I think it's just acknowledging as a film how powerful these stories can be for good or ill. We have the scene of all the people in the bed, all under like the artificially induced sleep, and they come in to go in and dream, and as kind of the old guy says, like, or going to wake up because the dream is now more real to them. I mean, considering like the fidelity and intensity of the dreams that this technology can possess, who is to say that they're wrong? If they're all feeling those visceral experiences, if you take as the assumption that like go along with I think therefore I am, like the only cognition you can be sure of is your own, then really you can't say that those experiences are any less real, and it's all dream or reality. It's our memories are all just sort of this story that we tell ourselves. And what makes it especially interesting, I guess, in terms of death, is how that story ends up being altered depending on the situation. So we have the death of the father, and this is presented as something, again, very cynical when you get right down to it, because the death of the father in the dream and the death of the father in real life were two completely different circumstances. When you go back to the real world with this idea planted, there is no father to contradict or counteract this narrative. And so the death in this moment still works like any other loss, and that when you are grieving in one way or another, like you do still end up constructing these narratives and trying to make sense out of something that seems cruel, whether your relationship with someone that you've lost is for good or ill, or how close or not close you were to them. It still ends up being part of a narrative that you spin in your head, and we see that with both Fisher and his father, and also with Cobb and Maul, and that you can contextualize that in two different ways. And I think the movie sort of acknowledges that there's validity to both approaches, and that Cobb should feel the full weight of his guilt for his repercussions for sort of planting the idea that ultimately leads to Maul's death, but also that, in a way, they did grow old together, and they did experience a full lifetime. But in the context of the movie, I don't think it's trying to present Maul as someone who's completely crazy. I think that with her role in the story, it's showing like just how tenuous our connection to what reality is, and how when you build certain narratives that can lead to certain destructive or damaging results. It's all about narratives. It all keeps coming back to narrative, man.
Yeah, I've gotten that from. I feel you've done a solid job of explaining it. Is how I will tacitly respond to that. So yeah, I'm gonna actually just let your interpretations hang. I think like there's nothing I can really add to them. There's nothing I can really react with or interact with in terms of how you understand the movie. I think that that's a very solid interpretation of it. I think that there's a lot to take and run with. I do, however, kind of want to talk about some of my nitpicks with the movie, if we're okay with that.
Do it. I'm here. I'm ready for him. I'm ready to catch this football.
All right. So we have in past episodes like Ready Player One and our conversation about A Quiet Place discussed rules and how movies interact with the rules that they set up in their universe. And on those episodes, in general, I have played the role of who gives a shit. We're looking too nitpicky and that it's undermining some of the integrity of the movie to do an analysis in this way because it doesn't actually add anything to it and arguably detracts from a serious critique of the movie. I'm going to flip on that in this one for an understandable reason, I would say. Because as loosey-goosey as Inception plays with its ideas, given that it's in a dream and everything, and so, like, you know, things might not necessarily make sense at all times, and I'm fine with that. Like, at one point he doesn't have a grenade launcher, then he does. Okay, sure, you know, that makes sense. It's a dream. Not everything makes sense. Sometimes things just happen. There are a number of rules that they kind of set up and then break really quickly after. And I'm going to really just kind of harp on one in particular because I think it is the most emblematic of the issue. And like there are small ones other than this, but I feel like to understand this one is to kind of get where my problems with the movie lie and why I think that the smaller issues that are around it aren't as easy to brush off. Namely in how the world handles gravity and shifts thereof. We see Cobb. We have now captured the son of the business mogul. They are all in a dream, hanging out with each other, while our potions master, Severus Snape, drives a van around the water world. And in doing so, we start to see the shifts in gravity as he turns the car and the world kind of bends with everyone in the car. And it's a really neat effect and does, you know, to great effect, honestly. And then at one point he tries to wake everyone up, so he drives backwards off a bridge. And going off this bridge puts everyone in 0G because, you know, they have no gravity in that instance. And so it impacts the layer down. So they're on layer 2 and everyone is now in 0G. And like there's a whole conundrum around it that's pretty cool, and like I like how they worked around it and everything like that. The problem is that there's a third layer going on, and if we are to understand that the layer directly above the status of your body, brain, gravity situation directly impacts that layer, the layer that's in, you've got layer 1 in 0G because you're going backwards. Layer 2 is in 0G as a direct result of that because their brains in layer 1 assume 0 gravity. Layer 2 then is in 0 gravity, which, because their brains would also feel 0 gravity, should apply to layer 3. Now, I'm perfectly willing to let it slide for limbo because, like, limbo is clearly its own thing. Laws change in that area. Fine. I'm all right with that. I just think that after they've spent quite a bit of time establishing that, you know, the status of the level above directly impacts the status of the layer below, the fact that we don't see that impact from 2 to 3 is, as I said, it's just one of those itches in the back of my skull that I can't quite scratch. And very much just a solid microcosm of what I have issues with in terms of rules.
So you're absolutely right in the fact that this movie goes very much out of its way to explain a bunch of rules. In fact, that's the whole purpose of the first half, is to sort of set up the heist and make everything clear so you can make everything go wrong later. It's a classic setup, only this time it's got like a sci-fi, like fantasy angle. So you're absolutely right that it is definitely a craft problem to at least a certain extent, that they are relying so heavily on these rules, and then break ones that seem to be pretty important. And obviously, as far as like someone's subjective experience of whether or not something bothered them, like, unless like what that person is saying was just like wrong, like I can't really argue with it, and what you're saying isn't wrong. Like, you're absolutely right in terms of the logic of the movie. What I will say from my own experience, just to kind of put this in context with our previous conversation about Ready Player One and A Quiet Place, because particularly with A Quiet Place, I felt like I was being the guy who was harping on these nitpicks, and even then while I was doing it, I was worried I was giving the impression that I was a like CinemaSins boy. So let me make it abundantly clear right now that I think that sort of approach to criticism is complete bullshit. But
I'm gonna echo that too, really quick, just because like we want to make this clear.
Yeah, we are hard line against like nitpicking as a substitute for thorough, like, thoughtful criticism. I think it's fair to say. Is that a fair statement to make? Am I misrepresenting you in any way?
No, I think that works. I think, like, if you're going to have a criticism of it, to go through and pick out little things that don't necessarily line up with everything else is not worth it. I'm going to defend what I am doing right now and defend what we have done in the past really quick. And I'm sure, like, this is what you're building to as well. In that, like, what we are more discussing right now is not, like, oh, in this scene the character runs away, but in the next scene they're running back. It follows CinemaSins, which pisses me off to no end. In this scene, when we generally talk about rules and get into like this level of nitpicking, we're more discussing things that like the movie has clearly set up and is, playing with or breaking into its own right. Like, it's not doing just a little thing that, hey, from this scene to this scene, that clock moved half an inch. Oh no, 10 sin points. It's very much more just a discussion on, does this cause conflict within the viewers, or how does it impact the viewing experience? Not little things is what it boils down to.
Yeah, so and sort of to ride off of that, I think the difference for me is that, like, if you go back and listen to our Quiet Place episode, like, my problem with that movie was not necessarily that the characters were making bad decisions, or that, not everything they did make sense, or that, like, the logic of this or that didn't work. I mentioned some of those things because it didn't help with a lot of the problems I already had, but my core problem with A Quiet Place was that I didn't care about the family. And that was the central tension, and therefore that is why the movie didn't work for me. So, and I think for rules-driven movies, I think it is also fair to be more bothered by it if something does go out of its way to be very driven by, like, this doesn't really apply to either of the movies that we're talking about right now, but like a hard magic system, if you know what I mean, like something that they very clearly go out of their way to sort of establish. What I will say in terms of Inception and why it didn't bother me in this movie at all, and I'm going to harp on Ready Player One a little bit as sort of a counterpoint, is that for me, what those nitpicks add up to, if they do matter, they only matter insofar as they are detracting or supporting sort of the central atmosphere, the central emotional beats, the characters, like all that stuff. And so for me, so in something like Ready Player One, like I watch a lot of like YouTube criticism. I read a bunch of like film articles, so I've seen all the criticisms and nitpicks made about Ready Player One, and made quite a few of them myself in our episode. But the thing about Ready Player One is not that it it bothers me that this or that thing doesn't make sense. What bothers me about Ready Player One is that it gets the experience of being online completely wrong. What we see from the Oasis doesn't feel like any sort of recognizable emotional true thing about the internet, about video games, about online games, about any of these other topics. It just feels like a very false, very surface level construction of this sort of setting.
I think there's two very important things that are kind of takeaways from that. And that one is that this is a criticism that is arguably not a nitpick, because it is very much a personal criticism based on the experiences that you have had, and it has directly impacted your viewing of the movie. And it is based around the rules and understandings on how this would function. But it can also, on the same side, be almost perceived as a nitpick, because it's like, oh, well, we're just not in that time frame yet. So I feel like nitpicking, and this is absolutely going to go back to what I was saying, which is the Inception thing I was talking about, absolutely a nitpick. But it's one that directly impacted my viewing based on the rules that I have understood and established. So I think that to really get at the heart of it, it fucking depends.
Well, so that's the thing. That's always the tough thing about talking about movies, is that literally everything about a person's reaction to a movie is completely subjective. Don't at me about objective standards of quality. I will strike you down with words. Everything you feel and react to in a movie is fucking subjective. End of story. See, an ironic enough statement, because, there is no objective standard I can hold myself to in making that claim. Isn't postmodernism fun?
Oh man, I feel like we're watching you break down in real time.
But to get back on track about Inception here, acknowledging that, of course, depending on the semantics that could be seen, my statements about Ready Player One could be seen as a nitpick or not a nitpick in that context. But really, what I just want to use it as a framework to get at why all the stuff in Inception that bothered you didn't bother me. Just because for me, not only was that central theming about narrative so strong and so resonant to me, but also the atmosphere of the dreams and the sort of visual splendor of them. Because I was noting this while I was watching it, that as far as the way this movie looks, even a decade on, it's still a fucking treat. Barely aged a day. It looks a lot better than a lot of movies being released now, and that's pretty much completely thanks to Christopher Nolan being so dedicated to practical effects. But
praise the Lord.
Praise the Lord. Yeah, thank you, base Nolan. So there's that, but also that as far as my subjective experience with dreams and what I know about them, this feels very true to me in the way that dreams sort of play out more generally. A lot of, not just in terms of a lot of the statements that the characters make, but just in the way that a lot of things play out, the way cuts will be sort of atemporal sometimes, not everything will necessarily match in terms of the editing, and so that all feels very real. I know that, it maybe lacks some of the hallmarks of what people consider common shared dreams. I remember there were a lot of jokes about oh no, why isn't Fisher dreaming about being back in high school and having not studied for the test. Everyone has those dreams. But I think that without relying on those cliches, the movie still kind of gets at that sort of shared experience. And maybe I'm just biased because I have a friend who is very into dreams, or was very into dreams for a little while, and sort of a lot of the studies about that. And just from my conversations with him, I got sort of the feeling, the understanding that this movie was actually pretty accurate in a lot of ways as far as the mechanics of how people experience dreams and how they play out actually work. So again, we want to talk about subjectivity. So even just like me having those conversations with that friend versus you not having those conversations with that friend could be shaping what elements of this movie are sticking out as like feeling true or not true to either of us, which goes back to it all being about how we spin the narratives in our cognition, which goes back to Inception's central theme, which is why I think it's so fucking great.
And I mean, I think a lot of this too does boil down to, and this is, you had a very fine point on it. Like that would have been a very nice way to wrap everything up in a neat little bow. But I do kind of want to just quickly mention, like, I think a big part of this too does come down to how we enjoy movies, and this, obviously leans right into your themes. But like, you obviously tend to pick themes out of movies more easily than I do, and I will certainly occasionally pick out a theme, a la 2001, but I tend to watch with a much more keener eye in how rules are set up and how narrative follows through and whatnot. And I might not be as quick to pick up on the themes and everything, but I'll pick up on slightly different elements of it that might impact my viewing in one way or another. And so, like, while these rule breakings might not matter to you, they've clearly had a large impact on my viewing of a movie that at one point I absolutely adored and now just like a lot. It's little things like that just, depending on your outside influences and who you watch and who you watch and read to get the idea of how to interpret movies is really important. So yeah, you know what? Let's just pretend like what Jackson said was the ending of the podcast, because it was a much nicer way to end it. I've been Sean McKinda. You can find me on Twitter at Sean_McKinda, and on my website, isortof.com. Go do that.
And I'm Jackson Keller. You can find me on Twitter at JacksonJKeller. But what even is Twitter? Is Twitter even real? Is anything real? It's all just a construction. Twitter is a social construct. Don't at me.
Jaden Smith is on Twitter too, if you want more of that nonsense.
I'm Jackson Keller, and I have a liberal arts degree.
If you want news about the podcast, things that's going on, all that good stuff, occasional memes, because God help us, we all do memes now. You can follow the podcast at BADH_cast on Twitter. It's got some cool resources, stuff like that. You can also yell at us over there, but don't at Jackson. He's very clear about that. Big shout out to Lords of the Highway for the use of our theme song. It is Suicide Alternate Take off the album High Octane Low Expectations. Great album. Go check them out. Also a huge shout out to 25yearslatersite.com, a great resource for TV analysis as well as movie analysis. They're a bunch of cool people, and they're cool enough to host us even though we release nonsense like this every week. And I'm amazed that they're still putting up with us. Next week, I believe we're talking about Deadpool 2, so get ready for that one. Reviews are already coming in. I've heard decent things, so the first one was enjoyable.
I am, we'll get a little more into this, but I am just as a preview for next week. I just want this to be on the record. I am nervous because I enjoyed Deadpool 1 and thought that I wasn't really going to enjoy it. It was surprising for me, but I really liked it. And so then I ended up getting excited a little bit for Deadpool 2, and as I realized that, I'm now sort of bracing myself for a Kingsman Golden Circle situation. So come back next week. We'll see if that ends up shaking out.
Yeah, we'll see if lightning can strike twice for Fox. I bet it doesn't.
Don't you go into the ground. Don't you go